The summer evening air hung thick and humid over the quiet suburban street as Officer Marcus Thompson cruised slowly through the neighborhood in his patrol car. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the neat rows of houses, with their perfectly manicured lawns. This was supposed to be a quiet sector, one of those places where the biggest problems were usually noise complaints from late-night parties or the occasional domestic dispute. Marcus had been patrolling these streets for nearly 8 years, and he thought he knew every corner, every regular face, every car that belonged, and everyone that didn't. At 34 years old, he had built a reputation as a thorough, by-the-book officer who took his job seriously. His colleagues respected him, his supervisors trusted him, and he had never had a serious complaint filed against him. Tonight felt like any other routine patrol shift. As he turned onto Maple Street, something caught his attention. A black luxury sedan was parked at the curb, its engine running, with a lone occupant sitting behind the wheel. The car looked expensive, maybe a BMW or Mercedes, and it seemed out of place in this middle-class neighborhood. Marcus slowed his patrol car and observed the vehicle more carefully. The driver appeared to be a young black man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and he was talking on his phone. Something about the scene struck Marcus as odd. Who sits in a running car on a residential street at this time of evening, just talking on the phone? His training kicked in, and various scenarios began running through his mind. Could this be someone casing houses for a burglary? Maybe a drug dealer conducting business? Or perhaps someone waiting for an opportunity to commit some other crime? Marcus had seen enough suspicious activity in his years on the force to know that things weren't always what they seemed. He had arrested people who looked completely innocent but were actually involved in serious criminal activity. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him to investigate. He pulled his patrol car up behind the sedan and activated his emergency lights. The red and blue flashing reflected off the rear window of the luxury car, creating an eerie light show in the growing darkness. Marcus could see the driver look up into his rearview mirror, and the phone conversation appeared to end abruptly. Getting out of his patrol car, Marcus adjusted his uniform and approached the driver's side of the sedan. His hand instinctively moved closer to his service weapon, a habit developed over years of not knowing what to expect during any encounter. The driver's window was already down, and as Marcus got closer, he could see the man more clearly. The driver was indeed a young black man, well-dressed in what appeared to be an expensive suit. He had short, neat hair and appeared calm, though Marcus could sense a certain tension in his demeanor. The man's hands were visible on the steering wheel, which Marcus noted as a positive sign of cooperation. "Good evening, sir," Marcus said, maintaining his professional tone. "I'm Officer Thompson with the local police department. May I ask what you're doing here this evening?" The man in the car looked up at Marcus with what seemed like a mixture of resignation and frustration. "Good evening, officer. I was just making a phone call. Is there a problem?" Marcus studied the man's face, trying to read his expression and body language. Years of experience had taught him to look for signs of nervousness, deception, or potential danger. While the man seemed calm, there was something in his eyes that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It might have been annoyance or maybe something else entirely. "Well, sir, I noticed you've been sitting here for a while with your engine running, and this isn't exactly a parking area. I'm just checking to make sure everything is okay," Marcus explained, his tone remaining professional but firm. The man nodded slowly. "I understand your concern, officer, but I assure you I'm not doing anything illegal. I was just finishing up a work call before heading home." Marcus noticed that the man spoke with clear, educated diction, and his clothing suggested he was probably a professional of some kind. But Marcus had learned not to make assumptions based on appearances alone. Some of the most dangerous criminals he had encountered had been well-dressed and articulate. "I see. And what kind of work do you do, sir?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious but also probing for more information. There was a slight pause before the man answered, "I work for the federal government." This response caught Marcus's attention. It was vague, and in his experience, people who worked regular government jobs usually just said they worked for the post office or the IRS or whatever specific agency employed them. The phrase federal government seemed deliberately non-specific. "Could you be more specific about what agency you work for?" Marcus pressed. Again, there was a pause. The man seemed to be considering his words carefully. "I work in law enforcement, Officer Thompson." Now Marcus was really intrigued. A federal law enforcement officer sitting in an expensive car in a suburban neighborhood, being vague about his identity. This was either completely legitimate or something was very wrong with this picture. Marcus decided he needed to dig deeper. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification, please," Marcus said, his tone becoming more authoritative. The man reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and careful. Marcus tensed slightly, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon, but the man only pulled out a wallet. He handed Marcus what appeared to be a driver's license. Marcus examined the license under his flashlight. The name read David Johnson, and the address was local. Everything seemed to be in order, but Marcus still felt that something wasn't quite right about this situation. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, please," Marcus said. David Johnson looked up at Marcus with what was now clearly frustration. "Officer, is that really necessary? I haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, I'm conducting a routine investigation, and I need you to cooperate with my requests. Please step out of the vehicle." With a deep sigh, David Johnson opened his car door and slowly got out. He was tall, probably around 6 feet, and his expensive suit fit him perfectly. Everything about his appearance suggested success and respectability, but Marcus had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon reveal shocking truths and change both men's perspectives forever. David Johnson stood beside his car, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but Marcus could see the growing frustration in his eyes. The evening air was still warm, and a few neighbors had begun to notice the flashing police lights, with some peering out from behind curtains, and others stepping onto their front porches to get a better look at the unfolding scene. "Officer Thompson," David said, his voice remaining calm but with an edge of irritation, "I really don't understand why this is necessary. I've shown you my identification. I've answered your questions, and I haven't committed any crime." Marcus studied David's demeanor carefully. In his 8 years of police work, he had encountered many people who claimed innocence while actually being involved in criminal activity. He had also learned that sometimes the most dangerous situations were the ones that seemed routine and safe. His training had taught him to never let his guard down, no matter how cooperative a suspect appeared to be. "Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your cooperation, but I still have some questions about why you're here," Marcus replied. "This is a residential neighborhood, and sitting in a running car for an extended period raises some concerns. I'm sure you can understand that." David took a deep breath, and Marcus could see him struggling to maintain his composure. "Officer, I was simply making a private phone call related to my work. Sometimes I prefer to take sensitive calls away from my home to avoid disturbing my family. There's nothing sinister about that." "And what exactly is the nature of your work?" "Mr. Johnson, you mentioned federal law enforcement, but you've been pretty vague about the details," Marcus pressed. David's jaw tightened slightly. "My work sometimes requires discretion, officer. I'm sure you can understand that not all law enforcement activities can be discussed openly." This response only heightened Marcus's suspicions. In his experience, legitimate law enforcement officers were usually proud to identify themselves and their agencies, especially to fellow officers. The continued vagueness was a red flag that something might not be right about David's story. "Sir, I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of your vehicle and spread your feet apart," Marcus instructed, his hand moving to his service weapon as a precautionary measure. David's eyes widened with shock and anger. "Officer Thompson, you cannot be serious. I am a federal law enforcement officer, and I have done absolutely nothing to warrant this treatment. Mr. Johnson, if you are indeed a law enforcement officer, then you should understand that I'm following proper procedures for an investigation. Now please comply with my instructions." The situation was quickly escalating beyond what either man had anticipated. David Johnson found himself in an impossible position. His work with the FBI often required him to maintain his cover and avoid revealing his true identity, even to local law enforcement. He had been working undercover on a sensitive case involving financial crimes, and his presence in this neighborhood was related to surveillance of a suspect who lived nearby. The phone call Marcus had observed was actually David coordinating with his FBI team about the ongoing operation. He had chosen this location specifically because it offered a good view of the suspect's house while appearing inconspicuous. The last thing he wanted was to blow his cover or compromise the investigation by revealing his identity to a local police officer who might inadvertently leak information. But now he found himself facing a situation where his refusal to be completely forthcoming was being interpreted as suspicious behavior. The irony was not lost on him that his commitment to maintaining operational security was now putting him in potential danger. "Officer Thompson," David said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am a federal agent, and I am currently working on an active investigation. If you proceed with this detention, you could be interfering with a federal operation." Marcus had heard similar claims before from people trying to avoid arrest or detention. Drug dealers had claimed to be DEA agents, car thieves had claimed to be FBI, and con artists had claimed to be everything from Secret Service to CIA. The fact that David was being so evasive about providing specific details only reinforced Marcus's belief that something wasn't right. "Sir, if you're really a federal agent, then you should have proper identification to prove it. All I've seen is a regular driver's license," Marcus replied. David's heart sank. His FBI credentials were locked in a secure compartment in his car, and he had been specifically instructed by his supervisors to avoid carrying them during this particular surveillance operation to maintain his cover. The suspect they were watching was known to have connections within local law enforcement, and there was concern that any official identification could potentially compromise the entire investigation if it fell into the wrong hands. "Officer, my official credentials are secured in my vehicle, but I cannot access them without potentially compromising an ongoing federal investigation," David explained, his frustration growing. Marcus interpreted this as another evasive answer. "Mr. Johnson, I've been patient with you, but your continued reluctance to provide proper identification is concerning. I'm going to ask you one more time to place your hands on the hood of your vehicle." By now, several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, some of them recording the interaction with their cell phones. The flashing police lights had attracted attention throughout the neighborhood, and what had started as a routine traffic stop was quickly becoming a public spectacle. David could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, but he felt trapped between his duty to his FBI operation and his need to resolve this confrontation with the local police officer. He knew that revealing his true identity could potentially compromise months of investigative work and put his team at risk. "Officer Thompson," David said, making one last attempt to resolve the situation peacefully, "I am asking you, as one law enforcement officer to another, to please trust me when I tell you that I am here on official business. I cannot provide you with the details without potentially compromising an active investigation." Marcus had reached his limit with what he perceived as evasive and suspicious behavior. "Sir, I've given you multiple opportunities to provide proper identification and explain your presence here. Your refusal to comply with reasonable requests is forcing me to take action." The tension in the air was palpable as both men found themselves locked in a standoff that neither had wanted or anticipated. David Johnson, a dedicated FBI agent trying to do his job while maintaining operational security, and Marcus Thompson, a conscientious police officer following his training and instincts, were about to collide in a way that would change both of their lives forever. The gathering crowd of neighbors watched in fascination and concern as the situation continued to escalate, unaware that they were witnessing the build-up to a confrontation that would soon reveal shocking truths and challenge everyone's assumptions about identity, authority, and the complex world of law enforcement. The standoff between Marcus Thompson and David Johnson had reached a critical point. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol car continued to illuminate the suburban street, casting an eerie glow over the scene as more neighbors gathered to watch the drama unfold. Cell phone cameras were now openly recording from multiple angles, and the murmur of concerned voices added to the tension that hung thick in the evening air. Marcus could feel his heart rate increasing as he assessed the situation. David Johnson was not complying with his lawful orders, continued to be evasive about his identity and purpose, and seemed to be growing more agitated with each passing moment. In Marcus's mind, this was textbook suspicious behavior that warranted further investigation, regardless of whatever claims the man was making about being a federal agent. "Mr. Johnson, this is your final warning," Marcus said, his voice firm and authoritative. "I am ordering you to place your hands on the hood of your vehicle and assume the position for a pat-down search. If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to place you under arrest for obstruction of justice and failure to identify yourself properly to a law enforcement officer." David Johnson felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. Here he was, a decorated FBI agent with over 6 years of federal service, being threatened with arrest by a local police officer who refused to believe his identity. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. He had spent years investigating criminals, tracking down fugitives, and working to protect the public, and now he found himself being treated like a suspect. "Officer Thompson, I am begging you to reconsider," David said, his voice taking on a tone of desperation. "I am telling you the truth about who I am and what I'm doing here. If you arrest me, you will be making a serious mistake that could have far-reaching consequences for both of us." But Marcus had made up his mind. Years of police training had taught him to trust his instincts, and everything about this situation screamed that David Johnson was not who he claimed to be. The expensive car, the vague answers, the refusal to provide proper identification, and the growing agitation all pointed to someone who was hiding something significant. "Sir, you are under arrest," Marcus announced, reaching for his handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." David Johnson's heart sank as he heard the familiar Miranda warning being read to him. This was a nightmare scenario that he had never imagined could happen. As Marcus approached with the handcuffs, David made a split-second decision that would prove to be crucial later. "Wait," David called out. "Before you cuff me, I need to tell you something important. There are FBI agents positioned throughout this neighborhood right now as part of an active surveillance operation. If you arrest me, you're going to have federal agents converging on this location within minutes." Marcus paused for a moment, considering David's words. This could be another attempt to avoid arrest, or it could be the truth. But his training told him to proceed with the arrest first and sort out the details later. If David really was an FBI agent, then proper channels could be used to verify his identity after he was safely in custody. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Marcus ordered. With a deep sigh of resignation, David Johnson complied. He knew that resisting arrest would only make the situation worse and could potentially endanger the civilians who were watching. As the cold metal handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he felt a mixture of anger, frustration, and profound disappointment in the system he had dedicated his career to serving. The crowd of neighbors watched in stunned silence as the well-dressed man was handcuffed and led toward the police car. Some were recording video, others were whispering among themselves, and a few were calling friends and family to tell them about the dramatic scene unfolding on their quiet street. "This is unbelievable," David muttered, as Marcus guided him toward the back seat of the patrol car. "I cannot believe this is actually happening." Marcus opened the rear door of his patrol car and helped David get seated inside, being careful to protect his head as he ducked into the vehicle. The back seat of a police car was designed for suspects and criminals, with hard plastic seats, no door handles on the inside, and a metal cage separating the back from the front. David had put countless suspects in similar seats during his FBI career, but he had never imagined he would experience it from this perspective. As Marcus closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, David sat in the back seat feeling a mixture of emotions he had never experienced before. The handcuffs were tight around his wrists, the plastic seat was uncomfortable, and the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He was under arrest, and there seemed to be no immediate way to prove his identity without compromising his ongoing investigation. Marcus got into the driver's seat and began filling out the preliminary arrest paperwork. "Mr. Johnson, or whatever your real name is," he said, glancing back at David through the metal cage, "you're being charged with obstruction of justice, failure to properly identify yourself to a law enforcement officer, and loitering with intent to commit a crime." "Officer Thompson," David said, his voice steady despite his circumstances. "I want you to remember this conversation when the truth comes out. I tried to tell you who I am, and I tried to warn you about the consequences of arresting me. You chose not to listen." Marcus started the engine of his patrol car, preparing to transport David to the police station for booking and processing. "Save it for the judge, pal. I've heard every story in the book, and yours is just another creative attempt to avoid taking responsibility for whatever you were really doing here." As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, David Johnson looked out the window at the neighborhood where he had been conducting legitimate FBI surveillance just an hour earlier. The house of the suspect he had been watching was still visible in the distance, and he wondered how this arrest would affect the months of investigative work that his team had put into the case. Neither Marcus Thompson nor David Johnson could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change. Within the next few hours, phone calls would be made, supervisors would be contacted, and the truth would begin to emerge in ways that would shock everyone involved. The patrol car disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a crowd of confused neighbors and a situation that was far more complicated than anyone realized. The arrest that Marcus thought was routine was actually the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about law enforcement. Identity, and the importance of listening when someone tries to tell you who they really are. The fluorescent lights of the police station booking area cast a harsh, sterile glow over everything as Marcus Thompson led David Johnson through the processing procedures. The station was busy for a Thursday evening, with officers coming and going, phones ringing constantly, and the general buzz of law enforcement activity filling the air. David had been in dozens of police stations during his FBI career, but never as a suspect being processed for arrest. The booking sergeant, a veteran officer named Rita Martinez, who had seen everything in her 20-year career, looked up from her paperwork as Marcus approached her desk with David in handcuffs. "What do we have here, Thompson?" she asked, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the well-dressed man in expensive clothing who clearly didn't fit the typical profile of their usual arrestees. "Picked him up for obstruction and failure to identify," Marcus explained, handing over his preliminary report. "Found him sitting in a luxury car in a residential neighborhood, acting suspicious. Claims to be some kind of federal agent, but couldn't provide proper identification to back it up." Sergeant Martinez raised an eyebrow as she looked at David Johnson. In her 2 decades of police work, she had processed thousands of arrestees, and this man definitely stood out. His clothing alone probably cost more than most people made in a month. His demeanor was calm and professional despite his circumstances, and something about his bearing suggested he was exactly what he claimed to be. "Sir, what's your full name and date of birth?" she asked David, beginning the standard booking questions. "David Marcus Johnson, born March 15, 1992, David replied, his voice steady and cooperative despite his frustration with the situation. As Sergeant Martinez began typing the information into the computer system, David made a decision that he hoped would help resolve the situation without completely compromising his ongoing investigation. "Sergeant Martinez," David said, reading her name tag. "I need to make a phone call. I understand that I'm entitled to one phone call, and I would like to exercise that right immediately." Marcus, who was standing nearby completing his paperwork, looked up with interest. "Planning to call a lawyer already? That was quick." David ignored Marcus's comment and focused on Sergeant Martinez. "I need to call my supervisor at the FBI. His name is Special Agent in Charge Robert Chen, and he can verify my identity and explain why I was in that neighborhood tonight." Sergeant Martinez paused in her typing and looked at David more carefully. There was something about his tone and the specific way he mentioned his supervisor that gave her pause. She had processed plenty of people who claimed to be law enforcement officers, but most of them were vague about details or provided information that was obviously false. David's request seemed different somehow. "FBI, huh?" she said. "You got a badge number or some other way we can verify this?" David nodded. "My badge number is 47291, and my supervisor's direct line is 202-550147. Special Agent in Charge Chen is based out of the Washington field office, but he's currently overseeing operations in this region." Sergeant Martinez wrote down the information, noting how readily David provided specific details that could easily be verified or disproven. Most people making false claims about law enforcement connections were much more vague about such easily checkable facts. Marcus, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward. "Sergeant, I don't want to interfere with booking procedures, but this guy has been giving me vague and evasive answers all evening. Now suddenly he's got all these specific details? Something doesn't add up." "Thompson, I understand your concerns," Sergeant Martinez replied, "but part of our job is to verify information when possible. If this man really is FBI, we need to know that sooner rather than later." She led David to a phone in the booking area and dialed the number he had provided. David felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as he heard the phone ringing. He knew that calling his supervisor would likely compromise his cover and potentially affect the surveillance operation, but at this point, he had no choice. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Special Agent in Charge Chen speaking. Sir, this is Agent David Johnson. I'm currently being held at the local police station on charges of obstruction of justice. I need you to verify my identity to the booking sergeant." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and David could practically hear his supervisor's mind racing as he processed this unexpected development. "Agent Johnson, are you saying you've been arrested?" Chen asked, his voice reflecting both concern and confusion. "Yes, sir. I was conducting surveillance as part of Operation Financial Web when I was approached by a local police officer. I tried to maintain my cover as instructed, but the situation escalated, and I'm now in custody." Special Agent in Charge Chen had been with the FBI for over 15 years, and he had never had one of his agents arrested while on duty. This was an unprecedented situation that would require careful handling to protect both the agent and the ongoing investigation. "Put the booking sergeant on the phone," Chen instructed. David handed the phone to Sergeant Martinez, who introduced herself and explained the situation from the police department's perspective. She could hear the authority and professionalism in Chen's voice as he confirmed David's identity and FBI status. "Sergeant Martinez, I can confirm that David Johnson is indeed a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Chen said. "He is currently assigned to my unit and was conducting official business when this incident occurred." Sergeant Martinez felt a sinking feeling in her stomach as the reality of the situation became clear. They had arrested a federal agent who had been doing his job. She looked over at Marcus Thompson, who was still standing nearby, and could see, from his expression, that he was beginning to realize something was seriously wrong. "Sir, What documentation do you need me to fax to verify Agent Johnson's status? Sergeant Martinez asked. I'll have his complete credentials and assignment documentation faxed to your station within the next 10 minutes, Chen replied. I'm also dispatching 2 other agents to your location to coordinate Agent Johnson's release and discuss how this situation affects our ongoing operation. As Sergeant Martinez hung up the phone, the booking area fell silent except for the usual background noise of the busy police station. Marcus Thompson stood frozen in place as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. David Johnson, still handcuffed, looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed vindication with disappointment. Officer Thompson, I tried to tell you who I was. I tried to explain that arresting me would create complications. You chose not to believe me. Marcus felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about the situation had just been turned upside down. The suspicious man in the expensive car, the evasive answers, the refusal to provide identification, all of it suddenly made sense from a completely different perspective. Sergeant Martinez began the process of removing David's handcuffs while they waited for the FBI documentation to arrive. The mood in the booking area had changed dramatically from routine processing to damage control as everyone involved began to realize the magnitude of what had just occurred. Within minutes, the fax machine began printing pages of official FBI documentation confirming David Johnson's identity, assignment, and authorization to conduct surveillance operations in the area. Each page that printed felt like another nail in the coffin of what had started as a routine traffic stop and had become a law enforcement nightmare. The atmosphere in the police station had shifted dramatically as the fax machine continued to churn out official FBI documents confirming David Johnson's identity and status. Sergeant Martinez carefully reviewed each page as it printed, her experienced eyes taking in the federal seals, official signatures, and detailed information that left no doubt about the authenticity of David's credentials. Marcus Thompson stood nearby, feeling as though he was watching his career crumble before his eyes. The confident certainty he had felt just an hour earlier had been completely replaced by a growing sense of dread and disbelief. He had arrested a federal agent. Not only that, but he had arrested a federal agent who had repeatedly tried to tell him the truth about his identity and mission. David Johnson, now free from handcuffs, rubbed his wrists where the metal restraints had left red marks. He watched Marcus's face carefully, seeing the range of emotions playing across the officer's features: shock, embarrassment, fear, and what appeared to be genuine remorse. Officer Thompson, David said quietly, his voice lacking the anger that Marcus might have expected. I want you to understand that I don't take any pleasure in seeing you go through this realization. I know you were trying to do your job, and I respect that. Before Marcus could respond, the front doors of the police station opened, and 2 individuals in dark business suits walked in with the purposeful stride that immediately identified them as federal agents. They approached the booking desk and flashed their credentials to Sergeant Martinez. I'm Special Agent Sarah Williams, and this is Special Agent Michael Rodriguez, the woman said. We're here to coordinate the release of Agent Johnson and to discuss the implications of this incident for our ongoing operation. Special Agent Williams was a veteran FBI investigator with 12 years of experience, and her reputation for professionalism and thorough case management had made her one of Special Agent in Charge Chen's most trusted supervisors. Agent Rodriguez, her partner for the past 3 years, was known for his diplomatic skills and ability to manage delicate interagency situations. David stood up as his colleagues approached, and the reunion was both professional and slightly awkward given the circumstances. Sarah, Michael, I'm sorry you had to come down here. This situation got completely out of hand. Don't apologize, David, Agent Williams replied. From what SAC Chen told us, you were following protocol by maintaining your cover. Sometimes these things happen when different levels of law enforcement aren't coordinated. Sergeant Martinez handed the FBI credentials and documentation to Agent Williams, who reviewed them quickly before nodding her approval. Everything appears to be in order. Agent Johnson is free to go, and all charges should be dropped immediately. Marcus Thompson, who had been standing quietly during this exchange, finally found his voice. Agent Johnson, I owe you a sincere apology. I was wrong about your identity, and I was wrong to arrest you. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that I should have listened more carefully to what you were telling me. David turned to face Marcus, and for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. David could see the genuine remorse in Marcus's eyes, and despite his frustration with the entire situation, he recognized that the police officer had been acting on his training and instincts. Officer Thompson, I appreciate your apology, David said. I understand that from your perspective, my behavior seemed suspicious. I was being deliberately vague about my identity because I was trying to protect an ongoing investigation. In retrospect, I can see how that would raise red flags for a conscientious police officer. Agent Williams stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to turn this unfortunate incident into something constructive. Officer Thompson, Agent Johnson, I think we can all learn something from what happened here tonight. This kind of miscommunication between federal and local law enforcement is more common than any of us would like to admit. She looked directly at Marcus as she continued. Officer Thompson, your instincts about suspicious behavior weren't necessarily wrong. Agent Johnson was engaged in surveillance activity, which can appear suspicious to someone who doesn't know the context. The problem was that he couldn't reveal that context without potentially compromising his mission. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the impossible position that David had been placed in. I can see that now, Agent Williams. But at the time, all I saw was someone being evasive and uncooperative. My training taught me to be suspicious of that kind of behavior. And that training serves you well in most situations, Agent Rodriguez added. The challenge is that sometimes legitimate law enforcement activities can look suspicious to other law enforcement officers who don't have the full picture. David Johnson had been thinking about the broader implications of what had happened, and he realized that this incident could actually serve as a valuable learning experience for everyone involved. Officer Thompson, David said, I want you to know that I don't hold any personal grudges about what happened tonight. You were doing your job as you understood it, and I respect that. But I hope this experience might help you understand that sometimes there are layers to a situation that aren't immediately apparent. Marcus felt a wave of relief that the FBI agent wasn't seeking to file complaints or pursue disciplinary action against him. Agent Johnson, I can promise you that this experience will definitely change how I approach similar situations in the future. I'm going to be more open to listening when someone tries to explain their circumstances, even if their initial answers seem evasive. Sergeant Martinez, who had been observing the exchange, stepped forward with a suggestion. Agent Williams, Agent Rodriguez, I think this might be a good opportunity for us to discuss better coordination between our agencies. We obviously need better protocols for situations where federal agents are operating in our jurisdiction. Agent Williams nodded enthusiastically. That's an excellent suggestion, Sergeant Martinez. We'd be very interested in setting up some kind of liaison system to prevent this type of misunderstanding in the future. As the group continued to discuss ways to improve interagency communication and coordination, David Johnson reflected on the events of the evening. What had started as a routine surveillance operation had turned into an arrest, a revelation, and ultimately an opportunity for better understanding between different levels of law enforcement. The incident had revealed important truths about assumptions, communication, and the complex world of law enforcement, where federal agents, local police, and ongoing investigations sometimes collide in unexpected ways. Most importantly, it had shown that even when mistakes are made, people of good faith can come together to learn from those mistakes and work toward better outcomes in the future. The police station booking area, which had been filled with tension and confusion just an hour earlier, now buzzed with constructive conversation about cooperation, understanding, and the shared mission of law enforcement at all levels. 3 weeks had passed since the incident that changed both Marcus Thompson and David Johnson's perspectives on law enforcement, assumptions, and the importance of communication. The immediate crisis had been resolved that night at the police station, but the ripple effects of what happened continued to influence both men's careers and personal growth in unexpected ways. Marcus Thompson sat in the conference room of his police station, participating in the first joint training session between local law enforcement and federal agents that had been organized as a direct result of his encounter with David Johnson. The room was filled with officers from several local departments, along with FBI agents, DEA representatives, and other federal law enforcement personnel. The training session was being led by Agent Sarah Williams, who had become the point person for improving interagency coordination in the region. She stood at the front of the room with a presentation that used Marcus and David's incident as a case study in communication challenges between different levels of law enforcement. The situation we're going to discuss today illustrates how easily misunderstandings can occur when federal agents are operating in local jurisdictions without proper coordination, Agent Williams explained to the assembled group. Officer Thompson and Agent Johnson were both doing their jobs correctly according to their training and protocols, but lack of communication nearly created a serious problem. Marcus had initially been reluctant to have his mistake used as a teaching example, but he had come to understand that sharing the experience could help prevent similar incidents in the future. He had volunteered to participate in the training program, even though it meant publicly acknowledging his error in judgment. David Johnson, who was also present at the training session, had insisted that the focus should be on systemic improvements, rather than individual blame. Over the past 3 weeks, he had worked closely with local law enforcement agencies to develop better protocols for federal operations in their jurisdictions. Officer Thompson, Agent Williams said, turning to Marcus, "Can you walk us through your thought process during the initial encounter?" Marcus stood up, feeling nervous but determined to be helpful. "When I first saw Agent Johnson in his car, everything about the situation seemed suspicious to me. A lone individual in an expensive car, parked in a residential neighborhood, talking on the phone for an extended period. Based on my training and experience, these were all potential indicators of criminal activity." He paused, looking around the room at his fellow officers and the federal agents who were listening intently. "What I failed to consider was that legitimate law enforcement activities can sometimes appear suspicious to other officers who don't have the full context. I was so focused on what seemed wrong about the situation that I didn't really listen when Agent Johnson tried to explain his presence." Agent Rodriguez, who had also been involved in resolving the incident, added his perspective. "The challenge from the federal side is that agents often can't immediately reveal their identity or mission without potentially compromising ongoing investigations. This creates a situation where both sides are operating with incomplete information." David Johnson raised his hand and was acknowledged by Agent Williams. "I'd like to add that Officer Thompson's instincts weren't wrong. I was conducting surveillance, which by its nature involves behavior that could appear suspicious. The problem was that I couldn't explain the legitimate reasons for my actions without potentially damaging our investigation." The training session continued with discussions about new protocols that had been developed to address these communication challenges. A secure hotline system had been established that would allow local officers to quickly verify the identity and status of federal agents operating in their jurisdictions. Additionally, federal agencies committed to providing general notifications to local law enforcement when operations were planned in their areas without compromising specific operational details. After the formal training session ended, Marcus and David found themselves talking privately in the hallway outside the conference room. Their relationship had evolved from adversarial to respectful, and both men had learned valuable lessons from their encounter. "You know, Marcus," David said, using the officer's first name for the first time, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that night. In some ways, I'm glad it did happen, because it's led to improvements that will benefit everyone." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I have to admit, David, that whole experience really shook me up. It made me realize how many assumptions I make during my daily work, and how those assumptions can sometimes lead me in the wrong direction. The important thing is that we both learned from it, David replied. I've started to think more carefully about how my actions might appear to other law enforcement officers, and I've become better at finding ways to communicate necessary information without completely compromising operational security. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Police Chief Robert Martinez, Sergeant Martinez's husband, who had been following the Interagency Cooperation Initiative with great interest. Chief Martinez had seen the positive changes that had resulted from the incident and wanted to commend both men for their professionalism in handling the aftermath. "Officer Thompson, Agent Johnson," Chief Martinez said as he approached them, "I wanted to personally thank you both for the way you've handled this situation. What could have been a major problem between our agencies has instead become an opportunity for improvement and better cooperation." Marcus felt a sense of pride that something positive had come from his mistake. "Chief Martinez, I have to say that working with Agent Johnson and the FBI on these new protocols has been one of the most educational experiences of my career. I feel like I'm a better officer because of what I learned." David smiled at Marcus's comment. "And I can say that working with local law enforcement has given me a much better appreciation for the challenges that officers face every day. We're all trying to serve the public, just from different angles and with different resources." Chief Martinez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that makes these partnerships successful. I understand that you're both going to be involved in training other officers and agents in these new protocols." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "Agent Johnson and I have been asked to travel to several other regions to share our experience and help implement similar coordination programs." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Chief Martinez expressing his appreciation for the positive outcomes that had resulted from what initially seemed like a negative incident. As he walked away, Marcus and David continued their own discussion about the broader implications of their experience. "You know what strikes me most about all of this?" David said. "It's how easy it is for people who are essentially on the same side to end up in conflict when they don't have complete information about each other's situations." Marcus agreed wholeheartedly. "It makes me think about how often that probably happens in everyday life, not just in law enforcement. People make assumptions about others based on limited information, and those assumptions can lead to unnecessary conflicts." As they prepared to leave the training facility, both men reflected on how much their perspectives had changed since that evening 3 weeks earlier. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a catalyst for personal growth, professional development, and systemic improvements that would benefit law enforcement officers and federal agents for years to come. The incident had taught them both valuable lessons about listening, understanding, and the importance of keeping an open mind even when situations seem clear-cut. Most importantly, it had shown them that mistakes, when handled with professionalism and a commitment to learning, can become opportunities for positive change and better cooperation between people who share common goals. Their story would continue to be told in training sessions across the country, serving as a reminder that effective law enforcement requires not just individual skill and dedication, but also communication, cooperation, and the humility to learn from unexpected encounters with fellow officers who may be working toward the same objectives from different perspectives.